The snow fell in heavy silence. It blanketed the remote town of Ash Pines, muffling sound, swallowing light. By December 24th, the storm had turned the streets into icy graveyards. Power lines sagged under the weight of ice, and the few Christmas lights that had been hung now flickered weakly, struggling as if to hold back an encroaching darkness. The radio crackled in the corner of the small cabin where Madison sat, staring out the frost-coated window. She had driven up here from Chicago, hoping for a quiet Christmas alone, away from the bustling city and the painful memories of last year. But the isolation felt heavier than she'd anticipated. The storm was worse than the forecasts had predicted, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Blizzard conditions expected through Christmas. Stay indoors and avoid travel, the radio announcer warned. His voice was distorted by static. Madison reached over and turned the dial, shutting off the only voice she'd heard in days. The loneliness was suffocating. She stared at her phone. No signal. Again. She'd been checking it compulsively, even though she knew the storm had knocked out the towers. Her fingers hovered over the screen, scrolling through old photos. There was one of her parents smiling in front of their giant Christmas tree, another of David, her fiancé, who was no longer here. Madison's chest tightened. She swiped the photo away and set the phone down. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked and fell with a muffled thud. Madison pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and sipped at the lukewarm cocoa in her hands. She told herself the storm would pass soon. It had to. Then the knocking started. At first, she thought it was the wind, a faint, rhythmic tapping, barely audible over the storm. But as she strained to listen, it became clear. The sound was too deliberate, too steady. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Her breath hitched. She turned toward the door. The cabin was remote, surrounded by dense woods. No one should be out there, not in this weather. Heart pounding, she crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. The knocking stopped. Madison stood there for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob before retreating back to the couch. She told herself it was just her imagination, cabin fever, isolation. But then it started again, louder this time. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" No response, only the howling wind. Madison grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it tightly as she approached the door again. Her breath fogged up the peephole as she looked out. Still nothing, but the knocking persisted, echoing through the small cabin like a heartbeat. She yanked the door open. The freezing air hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. Snow swirled in the darkness, but there was no one there. No footprints, no sign of movement. Just the wind, and the blinding white of the storm. She slammed the door shut, bolting it behind her, and backed away. Her chest heaved as she tried to calm herself. She was being ridiculous. It had to be the wind, or maybe the snow settling on the roof. She sat back down, gripping the poker tightly, and stared at the door. The knocking returned. This time, it came from the window. She spun around, her heart in her throat. The curtains fluttered slightly, disturbed by the draft, but the glass was frosted over, obscuring whatever was outside. Slowly, she approached the window, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She wiped at the frost with her sleeve. A face stared back at her. Madison screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the poker. The face was pale, almost corpse-like, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the frost-covered glass. She scrambled to pick up the poker, her hands shaking. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the window. The knocking started again, this time from the back door. It wasn't possible. No one could move that fast. No one should even be out here. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. "What do you want?" The knocking stopped. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the wind. Madison stood frozen, listening, waiting, and then faintly she heard it, a whisper. It came from everywhere and nowhere. A soft, rasping voice that sent chills down her spine. She couldn't make out the words, but it was growing louder, closer. She covered her ears, but the sound was inside her head, burrowing deep into her mind. "Leave me alone," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Madison fumbled for her phone, using the faint glow of the screen to navigate. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was all around her now, a cacophony of voices overlapping, pressing against her skull. And then it stopped. Silence. Utter, oppressive silence. Madison stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her vision blurred by tears. She turned slowly, her phone's light sweeping across the room. Nothing. She was alone. But then she saw it. The figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the faint glow of her phone. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same hollow light she had seen in the window. Madison froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The figure took a step toward her. She screamed and ran for the door, fumbling with the lock. Her fingers were numb, clumsy, and the bolt wouldn't budge. The figure was closer now, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. Madison threw herself against the door, pounding on it, screaming for help. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the figure's face, inches from her own, its mouth stretching wide, in a grotesque, inhuman grin. The storm passed by Christmas morning. The sheriff found the cabin empty, the door hanging open, snow drifting inside. There was no sign of Madison, no footprints leading away from the cabin, just a single set of marks in the snow, long and deep, like something had been dragged into the woods. On the cabin wall, scrawled in frost, were 3 words: "He is coming." It was Christmas Day, but the town of Ash Pines would never celebrate again.